Australia's military history told the stories of those who served. This is I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, and this is episode 75, recorded on the 29th of December 2025. Gunner William Henry Morcombe, Military Medal. Let's get started. G'day friends and welcome to the podcast in the last of 2025. Of course, I'm your host Ross Manuel, and boy am I cutting it real close to get a third episode out before the end of the year. Now, if you are new to the podcast, welcome, and please make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all future episodes, and please leave a review on either Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. It greatly helps the show. Now, I have a few updates since the last episode. The podcast also now has a merch store, and link to it is in the show notes and on the podcast website, thedocnetwork.net. At the moment, the selection is limited, but more is being added, and I do recommend you head over and share your feedback on how much the pricing is or what objects you would like us to buy. Now, if you are interested in purchasing the morale patch, either the Armored Emu Brigade patch or the podcast patch, both of them are still available, but they're available through the Ko-Fi store, not the shop front yet. I'm still trying to figure that out. Now, you also may notice that this episode does not have a subtitle. I really tried with this one, but nothing I came up with sounded right, as some stories lend themselves to neat summaries. This one, sadly, isn't one of those stories. But that's mainly because it actually came to me not in the normal way, but by way of Laurie Favell, our resident supplementary researcher. And at the end of the episode, I'll explain how it came to be. And with that out of the way, let's get started. William Henry Morcombe was born on the 2nd of September 1872 in Gympie in the colony of Queensland, the second son and third child of John Thomas Vickery Morcombe and Jane Leith Morcombe née Thomas. Not much is known of his early life until 1891 when he marries Elizabeth Leslie Humbley in Sydney in March, where he was working as a station hand, and the couple would have two children, Frank in 1891 and Stanley in 1893. Unfortunately, Elizabeth would petition for divorce on the grounds of desertion, which was granted in 1903, as Morcombe was apparently working as a station hand and general labourer in Queensland at the time, having sold all of the family's belongings before doing so. By 1912, according to the electoral roll for that year, he was working on Amiibo Station in the Muttaburra district of Queensland between Longreach, Winton and Hughenden, living with Hilda Florence Morcombe, whose vocation was listed as housewife, though there was no record of a marriage between them. By December of 1914, he travelled to Holsworthy Barracks in southwestern Sydney and enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. He listed his marital status as single and his father as his next of kin. He also listed his age as 38 years 3 months, which was at the time the maximum age for combat forces in the Australian Imperial Force. In actuality, he was 42. Originally posted to the 2nd Reinforcements for the 6th Australian Light Horse Regiment, part of the 9th Brigade, Morcombe underwent a brief period of training in Australia before departing Sydney aboard HMAT A-21 Marie on the 20th of February 1915. After transiting the Suez Canal and encamping in Egypt, he was formally taken on strength on the 6th of August 1915, the very day of the disastrous August offensive in the Gallipoli campaign began. Fortunately for Morcombe, the 6th Regiment was deployed to the far right of the Anzac Line in defensive positions and thus spared for most of the carnage suffered by their fellow troopers. While on Gallipoli, he was promoted to temporary Lance Corporal in October. However, he spent most of December ill with what was diagnosed as debility and was evacuated to the Australian General Hospital in Heliopolis, where he spent 45 days. In an article in the Sunday Times of Perth in November 1915, they described the condition of debility in the following terms, quote, "A medical examination might easily show that every organ of the body is acting normally, but the pallor of the face will usually show that the blood is thin. This is the root of the trouble. Debility is a loss of vitality, not affecting one part of the body, but the system generally," unquote. Now, this is actually for an article promoting a vitality elixir, and of course leans very heavily into the promotional side, but this was the way such ailments were explained to the public, especially one with such a broad and ill-defined symptoms. In the era before modern diagnostic tools, debility was the catch-all term that could refer to a range of ailments including dysentery, anemia, tuberculosis, bronchitis, scabies, gastritis, malaria, varicose veins, or heart trouble. Several of these were endemic to the Gallipoli Peninsula due to the conditions of that front, and also to be one of the handful of diagnoses occasionally used to describe cases of what we would now consider post-traumatic stress, then termed shell shock amongst other terms. However, Morcombe's service record gives no further details about what was actually affecting him or the precise nature of his condition. After a lengthy recovery, he would be taken on strength with the 2nd Reserve Regiment on the 1st of March 1916 at the Mahdi training camp in Egypt as the Australian and New Zealand forces were expanding following the evacuation from Gallipoli. While the 6th Light Horse Regiment would be sent to defend the Suez Canal, drawing on Morcombe's experience in horsemanship, he was transferred to Brigadier General Godfrey Irving's newly raised 5th Australian Division assigned to the 15th Field Artillery Brigade as part of the 60th Field Artillery Battery. Initially, Morcombe would be designated as a gunner at Tel El Kebir before being mustered as a driver when the 5th Division was sent by to ferry post to defend the Suez Canal on the 18th of April 1916. As a driver, he was responsible for transporting the brigade's guns, as well as general care of the horse teams that carted them. He would also serve as a backup gunner when required, and generally do the duties that were ancillary to maintaining the main guns. By the middle of June, Morcombe and what remained of the 5th Australian Division that was still in Egypt was now in Alexandria, boarding transports for the 2nd Anzac Corps' transfer to the British Expeditionary Force and service on the Western Front. He would spend a month in France with the 15th Brigade before being assigned to the 25th Field Artillery Howitzer Brigade. Prior to the First World War, Australia was very light on artillery pieces, having only equipped the Australian Imperial Force with 18-pounder field guns. While fine in general sense, they could not penetrate the well-prepared defensive works Germany was employing on the Western Front. To remediate this, Australian authorities raised a howitzer brigade for every division, comprising 12 4.5-inch howitzers, with the plan that these guns would have the punch required to break through German lines. Now, for those curious about the difference between a field gun and a howitzer, essentially, both are classified as light artillery, noted specifically for their mobility, being equipped with either wheels or tracks and being able to be moved either by hand or by horse. A field gun, otherwise known as a cannon, was your standard artillery piece prior to the First World War. Think of it as a really big rifle that fired shells essentially in a flat trajectory over a long range, which made them effective against targets in the open, like in battlefields of early conflicts, but had issues with obstacles like hills, trenches, and buildings. On the opposite end of the spectrum of the field gun is the mortar, which was highly portable and able to deliver rounds at a high arc over a short range that allowed it to land in a trench or on the opposite side of an obstacle. In fact, I have even heard stories of mortars on one side of a wall firing on targets on the opposite side of the wall. A howitzer is a weapon that falls between a mortar and a cannon, capable of firing in a direct fire role like a field gun, but also capable of providing plunging fire over obstacles or into trenches like a mortar, but with much more devastating effect. Morcombe and the 25th Field Artillery Brigade would occupy positions in Fleury on the 16th of July 1916 and prepared for the Australian Imperial Force's baptism of fire, the disastrous attack on Fromelles. They registered zones of fire, improved lines of communication as part of the left group, and prepared to support the attack. The Battle of Fromelles itself, fought from the night of the 19th of July 1916, was the first major engagement of the Australian forces on the Western Front and one of the bloodiest. Situated to the north of the Somme battlefield near the small French village of Fromelles, this attack was intended as a feint to draw away German reinforcements from moving south. The plan called for a largely inexperienced 5th Division alongside the newly arrived British 61st Division to assault heavily fortified German positions on a low waterlogged plain in full view of German trenches. Following a 6-hour preparatory bombardment, Australian and British troops climbed out of their trenches and advanced straight into German machine gun and artillery fire. The plan was hastily made and had poorly defined objectives, and while some units were able to reach the German lines, their positions were untenable, and by next morning the survivors were forced to withdraw. In less than 24 hours, the 5th Australian Division suffered over 5,500 casualties, making it the heaviest single day's loss in Australia's military history. Morcombe and the 25th Brigade's involvement in the Battle of Fromelles started at 11 a.m. on a, quote, continuous bombardment of the whole of the enemy's front trenches, unquote, before the curtain of fire was raised to allow the infantry to make their attack. This bombardment continued throughout the entirety of the attack, and casualties to the 25th were light, with only 4 injuries. Fortunately, the same was not true for the rest of the division. As military planners reviewed the outcome and determined that the battle was a costly failure, Morcombe and the rest of his fellow gunners were already conducting repairs in their positions and continued to support the forces in the region. While the 5th Australian Division was declared not fit for offensive action for many months, it did stay in the line. However, it was moved to the nursery sector of Armentières to regroup, retrain, and prepare for the following offensive season. The 25th Brigade, however, stayed in Fleury and supported Allied operations into the region until the middle of November, when they would be rotated to Mametz in the Somme region, where the brigade would be gradually granted leave, with Morcombe himself travelling to England in January. On his return, he'd be reassigned to the 14th Field Artillery Brigade, as the 25th Brigade would be disbanded. While on paper the plan of having independent howitzer brigades attached to every division showed merit, in application there was simply a lack of available guns, parts, or gunners to field them, and as a result, the 25th Howitzer Brigade, much like the other four howitzer brigades, would actually be gradually broken up at the start of 1917, and their guns and gunners would be reallocated to the existing Field Artillery Brigade serving as one of their batteries. As part of the 14th Field Artillery Brigade, Morcombe was assigned to the 54th Battery on the 3rd of October 1917. At that point, the 54th was in action east of Ypres, where he was on the receiving end of a German artillery barrage. At the time, Morcombe was undertaking linesman duties, repairing communication cables that then had been repeatedly severed during the barrage. As a result, he'd be awarded the military medal on the 21st of October 1917. The citation read, quote, Number 729, Gunner W. Morcombe, 54th Battery, who was a linesman, was continually on the lines, mending the brakes, and at such personal risk and disregard for his own safety, enabled the battery to complete its registration and thus successfully carrying out its task in the operations on the following day. The splendid work carried out by this man is deserving of special recognition, unquote. Unfortunately, roughly 2 weeks later, Morcombe's luck would run out as the 54th Battery would be subjected to a German gas attack, leading to his evacuation to England for treatment and marking him one of the 16,000 Australian servicemen who became a gas casualty. Now, both sides of the Western Front employed gas in an attempt to break the stalemate, despite the 1899 Hague Convention expressly prohibiting asphyxiating agents, and while Germany has been blamed in antiquity for the first usage of gas in the war, it was actually France who did it first when in August 1914 they deployed tear gas grenades, either xyl bromide or ethyl bromicate, and Germany followed suit later in the year. Intended as a lacrimatory agent, it causes intense eye irritation and uncontrollable tearing. As a weapon, it wasn't very effective as it usually dissipated within half an hour, but its use opened the door for a far more destructive evolution in the war. In April 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, Germany released chlorine gas on a large scale for the first time. When inhaled, chlorine reacted with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, severely damaging tissue, causing death or lasting respiratory injury, even with minor exposure, resulting in coughing, vomiting, and eye irritation. Although deadly, its effectiveness was ultimately short-lived as it could be countered with improvised measures as simple as a rag soaked in water or in a pinch urine. And it was notoriously dependent on the whims of the wind, a lesson the British discovered the hard way when they first used it during the Battle of Loos in September 1915, and the gas ended up landing on their own positions. In December 1915, France introduced the even more insidious phosgene again at Ypres. Less immediately irritating than chlorine, but regularly deployed alongside it, it targeted the lungs slowly. Instead of burning them, it caused the fluid to accumulate until the victim slowly asphyxiated. Of the approximately 91,000 deaths attributed to the gas in the Great War, some 85% are attributed to phosgene and its German derivative diphosgene. The one thing that differed it from chlorine was its delayed onset, with most symptoms taking between 24 and 48 hours to manifest. And while it reduced its immediate tactical impact, it amplified its psychological effect. Soldiers who believed themselves unscathed would then collapse fatally the next day. Probably the most famous, or infamous, of all the chemical weapons used during the First World War was mustard gas. First deployed by Germany in July 1917 near Ypres, unlike the other asphyxiants, mustard gas, which actually isn't a gas but a volatile, oily liquid, is a vesicant. It burned the skin, throat, lungs, and eyes, causing blisters and temporary blindness. Slower acting than chlorine but faster than phosgene, it could take hours before the blisters started to appear. Mustard gas's infamy, however, came from its persistence. As an aerosolized liquid, it tended to settle in low areas, shell craters, dugouts, trenches, and could contaminate bodies of water for days, virtually undetected until soldiers started developing blisters. This, used in conjunction with other chemical agents or traditional artillery, would force soldiers out of their defenses or force them to seek cover in already areas saturated by the gas. Though it only accounted for about 2% of all fatalities, its capacity to inflict long-term injury, scarring, chronic respiratory problems, and irreversible eye damage made it one of the most feared weapons of the war. With studies revealing a positive correlation between exposure and skin cancers and other respiratory and skin conditions, including leukemia, eye conditions, bone marrow depression, and subsequent immunosuppression, psychological disorders, and even sexual dysfunction. As the weapons became more sophisticated and the countermeasures evolved, chemical agents started to be used in combination with irritant compounds known as sternuators or vomiting agents such as diphenhchlorozine. These substances induced violent coughing, sneezing, and nausea inside the soldier's gas mask, forcing them to make a choice, either to remove the mask and expose themselves to the far more lethal agents released alongside it, or keep the mask on and endure choking spasms that could leave them incapacitated anyway. Morcombe's service record lists his injuries as gas poisoning under the code S, which was the British code for mustard gas, which was derived from the older code HS, which was rather derogatively derived from Hun stuff, or the slur used to refer to Germans. Originally treated at No. 56 General Hospital at Etaples, he was transferred to the Norfolk War Hospital in Norwich on the 10th of November 1917. While at Norfolk, it became apparent that his condition was not going to improve, and on the 19th of January 1918, he went before a medical review board where he was diagnosed with bronchitis and DAH, and it was recommended that he be discharged from the Australian Imperial Force with a pension. During the First World War, while medical treatments were advanced for their time, if it was determined that you were not going to recover within 6 months, you were generally sent home back to Australia to either receive additional treatment there or you be discharged. DAH, short for disordered actions of the heart, is an outdated term for soldiers who present with palpitations, breathlessness, dizziness, chest tightness, tachycardia, and exertion-based fatigue with no obvious cause. It has gone by many names throughout history, as such as soldier's heart, effort syndrome, and DeCosta's syndrome, among others, and depending on what army you were in, it was considered either a physical or a psychological condition and treated accordingly. For most of the First World War, Australia considered it a neuroses, though by 1917 there was a push to see it treated more as a physical condition instead of a psychological one. Modern interpretations are equally split between the two camps to this day, linking its diagnosis to both postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Morcombe departed England on the 19th of April aboard the transport ship RMS Orontes, arriving on the 12th of June. After ongoing additional treatments in Sydney, he was formally discharged from the Australian Imperial Force on the 21st of August 1918. Sadly, little is known about his post-war life. It is known he returned to Waverley, presumably to be near his sons, and also appears to have remained close to his ex-brother-in-law, Norman Robert Humbly, as in July 1919 the two gentlemen were both living in the same Liverpool Street address in Paddington, an inner-city suburb. This is despite the fact that his ex-wife remarried in 1916. Morcombe struggled with the effects of his gassing and was reported to be very depressed. Unfortunately, it was at this address where on the 5th of July 1919, driver William Henry Morcombe MM was found unresponsive in bed with a bottle of cyanide on the dressing table. He was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital where he sadly passed away shortly after admission, aged 45. He was survived by both of his sons. A coronial inquiry into his death returned the verdict of suicide, and he was buried in a private ceremony on the 8th of July in the Church of England section of the Waverley Cemetery. While we may never know the reasons why William Morcombe decided to take his life, and it would be inappropriate to speculate, he sadly is not an isolated case, as he would join the ranks of thousands of Australian veterans who, following the First World War, would take their life in the decades following the cessation of hostilities. Most of these men suffered the effects of gas or other physical or mental injuries at the time plagued by an influenza pandemic and the Great Depression. Though through a social stigma of the time, most of these deaths are often reported as accidents. Without extensive research, we may never know the exact number of Australians who died prematurely of war causes. We can only hope that they found peace that the war's end had promised them. Now, unlike other episodes, I didn't actually find out about William Morcombe in the traditional sense. Actually, this story came to me through Laurie Favell, a supplementary researcher, who actually came about knowing about Morcombe, not through research like we normally do, but through interaction that he had with a woman who wanted to know more about Morcombe. She wasn't related to him. Actually, she learned about him through a dream that she had, and she wanted to know more about him because of it. Have a good new year, everyone. Now, a lot of the research for this episode was already done before it was handed to me. Again, this is Laurie's story he's telling me. But additional references used in this episode are the National Archives of Australia, Trove, the online newspaper archive at the National Library of Australia, the Virtual War Memorial of Australia, the AIF Project, the Burt Whistle Wiki of Maritime Transport, the Australian Cemeteries Index and the Find a Grave website, the State Library of New South Wales, Wikitree and Ancestry.com, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. All work on this podcast is done without the use of AI. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History. This podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of each and every one of you, especially our Armed Emu Brigade community. This episode was recorded in the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we pay our respects to elders who have passed on knowledge for thousands of years. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license, and all opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or positions of any entity, agency, or organization. If you like what we do here and want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is share it with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Trust me, I read all the reviews and your feedback truly helps others find the show. You can also support us on Patreon, where your contributions will help keeping the podcast running. Plus, don't forget to check out our merch store for the Armoured Emu Brigade unit patches. They're perfect for any fan. To join in on the conversation, come chat with us on Discord. For more content, including photos, show notes, and transcripts, head over to the website at thedocnetwork.net and follow the show at IWODMJ on all social media. I'm at Doc Winters. Open and closing themes by Blue Dot Sessions. And once again, friends, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye. Australia's military history told through the stories of those who served. This has been a Doc Network production.